It was a cold March morning in 2021 when 4 bodies were discovered in a parked vehicle at the Albuquerque International Sunport. Among them, Jennifer Lannon, the 39-year-old mother of 3, Matthew Miller, just 21 years old, Jason Mata, and Randall Apostolon. A few days later, a 5th body turned up in New Jersey. The man who would soon be arrested, Sean M. Lannon, claimed responsibility, not just for these 5, but for 16 in total. But the truth behind his confession, his motive, and the havoc he left in his wake would prove more chilling than anyone imagined. Sean M. Lannon was born in 1974. Little is publicly known about his early life, but what investigators would later uncover paints a man deeply troubled, haunted by claims of trauma and abuse. He once alleged that Michael Dubkovsky, the New Jersey victim, had sexually abused him as a minor, a claim Lannon said motivated part of his actions. By early 2021, Lannon's life had fractured. His ex-wife Jennifer, née Whitman, and their children remained central to that fracture. Despite their separation, their shared history would become central to the unfolding tragedy. Welcome to Dark Matters TV, where every story is told with love and respect for the victim. If you're new here, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have been with us and yet to subscribe, go ahead and do that now. Like, share, and make sure to leave your thought below. Jennifer Lannon was known to family as a devoted mother, a woman whose life had narrowed and widened around the daily rhythms of children and struggles with prescription drugs that sometimes cost her custody and left the family worried and protective. The pain of that absence would make the shock of her body turning up at an airport feel unbearable to relatives who had last seen her as a mother who loved fiercely, and who even a year before had posted a birthday message to her child calling her unforgettable. Friends and Grants described Jennifer, Matthew, and Jason as a circle of acquaintances, while Apostolon was an older man who lived out of his car and would sometimes give rides for money. Descriptions that at first made investigators struggle to understand how these 4 ends had knotted together inside a pickup truck at the airport, and why someone would move their remains across state lines in the way they were found. 3 days after the Sunport discovery, the body of 66-year-old Michael Dubkovsky was discovered in his East Greenwich Township, New Jersey home, beaten to death in what prosecutors later described as a bludgeoning with a hammer. That killing would pull investigators across state lines and eventually connect to a man with military service in his past. A man who would be arrested in St. Louis driving the victim's car and who would become the named suspect in the Sunport deaths. By March 10, 2021, law enforcement had identified Sean Lannon, then 47, as a person of interest, and a U.S. Marshals Task Force arrested him in St. Louis after finding him in a blue Honda CR-V that had been reported stolen. The car belonged to Dubkovsky, and the arrest closed a cross-country manhunt, but opened a much larger set of questions when prosecutors said Lannon admitted not only to the New Jersey killing, but to the 4 bodies at the Sunport, and even to 11 other individuals, a claim that was relayed in court papers, and which investigators quickly declared pieces of Lannon's past emerged in reporting. He had ties to suburban Philadelphia and Gloucester County. He had served in the military and been described by defense counsel as an Army veteran with an honorable discharge. He had a history that included drug abuse and prior brushes with law enforcement. And in court he would later say he had been sexually abused as a child by the New Jersey victim, Michael Dubkovsky, an allegation prosecutors said they were investigating, but which would complicate the narrative and the motives presented at trial. That allegation of abuse, if true, suggested a personal and long-buried rage that could have contributed to the violence in New Jersey, but it did not explain the New Mexico deaths, and authorities would repeatedly stress that Lannon's claim to have killed many more people required evidence, not assertion, and that their work would focus on building an evidentiary case around the 4 bodies at the Sunport and the Dubkovsky death in New Jersey. Tell the human parts of this story, because the headlines cannot hold the whole weight. Jennifer Lannon left behind 3 children who were briefly taken east to family in New Jersey and then cared for by grandparents while the investigation unfolded. Matthew Miller was young, and his disappearance had first been noted in early January. Jason Mata had friends and acquaintances in a small town where everybody knew one another, and Randall Apostolon was a man on the margins who nevertheless carried memories and a life rendered suddenly absent by a crime scene at an airport that made strangers sober and weep. The families threw up fundraisers, they gave interviews in which bewilderment bled into grief, and out of the rubble of details the public saw not statistics but faces and birthdays, and the quiet smallness of ordinary lives shattered in a way that left a community looking for meaning. Investigators converged on Grants, New Mexico, and searched homes and vehicles while federal, state, and local agencies coordinated interviews. They traced cell phone pings, they followed purchase records, and forensic testing would take time because decomposition complicates cause-of-death determinations and because the movement of remains across long distances requires careful chain-of-custody work. But as the evidence mounted, it increasingly pointed at a pattern consistent with the affidavit. Bodies dismembered, placed into containers, transported, and then stored in a vehicle that reached a public place like an airport parking deck where they were eventually discovered. Each one of those steps leaving traces that investigators would painstakingly document as the case moved from cold discovery to active prosecution. In October 2022, Lannon pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Michael Dubkovsky, the Gloucester County case describing the 66-year-old as a mentor from Lannon's youth who had been involved with Big Brothers Big Sisters and whom Lannon later accused of sexually abusing him as a child. Prosecutors said the killing in New Jersey was a brutal bludgeoning with a hammer, and on December 22, 2022, he was sentenced to 35 years in New Jersey State Prison for that murder. That sentence would stand as the first formal accountability in a case that had begun to reveal itself as multi-jurisdictional and complex. While Lannon served the New Jersey sentence, New Mexico prosecutors pursued their own charges tied to the Sunport bodies, and by May 2024 he agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder counts in the deaths of the 4 people whose remains were found in the truck, a plea that included admissions and resolved the New Mexico cases without the need for protracted jury trials. And as part of that process, New Mexico judges imposed consecutive terms that amounted to multiple 15-year sentences, which when combined with the New Jersey term left Lannon facing decades, effectively the balance of his life behind bars. If you're interested in deeply investigated true crime stories, consider hitting subscribe and the bell so you don't miss our future episodes. We dive into the facts and the feelings behind the headlines here on Dark Matters TV. Throughout the investigation, Lannon's reported claim that he had killed up to 16 people remained a haunting uncertainty. Prosecutors relayed his admission at hearings, but local police in New Mexico said they had not found corroboration. No missing person reports that fit the alleged missing victims, and no forensic trace points that could immediately confirm 11 more deaths. The result was a sobering lesson about confessions, because someone can say almost anything in a moment of rage, remorse, or a desire for infamy, and it falls to detectives to either find the bodies and the paper trail that validates the statement or to rule the claim unsubstantiated. This ambiguity left families on both sides of the country in a painful place, some clinging to the need for closure and others winded by the possibility of further investigation. And while law enforcement never entirely closed the book on looking for other victims, they were transparent in reporting that no evidence had surfaced that matched Lannon's broader claim in the months after his arrest. If motive is a neat single thread, this case refused simplicity. The affidavit and interviews suggested jealousy and accusations of infidelity. Lannon told investigators he found his ex-wife with another man and believed drugs were being given to his children. He told them he shot Jennifer when she tried to die by overdose, and then he claimed a series of calculated steps thereafter. He also claimed long-term sexual abuse by the New Jersey victim, which prosecutors were investigating, and his history of substance abuse and instability painted a portrait of someone whose life had accumulations of grievance and chaos, any one of which could have contributed to violence. Together they can look like motive and fuel, and prosecutors argued they added up to pattern and intent in court. For prosecutors, a plea served several functions. It locked in convictions and guaranteed lengthy sentences without the time and resource costs of lengthy trials. For relatives of victims, it provided a measure of closure and spared them the trauma of reliving details in an open courtroom. And for defense attorneys, a guilty plea sometimes reflects calculation about the odds at trial and the potential exposure their client faced. But the public conversation often turns to whether plea deals always serve justice. In this case, the coordinated plea outcomes in 2 states meant Lannon would remain behind bars for decades, and the families would not have to endure another drawn-out courtroom contest. With a 35-year sentence imposed in New Jersey and consecutive sentencing in New Mexico that added decades to that total, Lannon now faces a combined set of terms that will confine him for the remainder of his life in practical terms. Whether the book on potential other victims is ever reopened depends on new evidence or credible leads. But for now, the courts closed the most immediate chapter with guilty pleas and rulings that place punishment solidly behind legal process. The human part of every trial is what remains after the legal system finishes its work. Jennifer's children were taken into family care, and her relatives described the double grief of losing a daughter and the rubble of questions she could no longer answer. Matthew Miller's friends and parents asked why a young life ended. Jesson Mata's community tried to stitch meaning into the void. And Randall Apostolin's life as a man on the road was a blunt reminder that victims come from every walk of life. The funerals and fundraisers and the photo carousels remind us that headlines are shorthand for people whose birthdays and idiosyncrasies end up included in a public ledger of tragedy. The multi-agency inquiry demonstrated how evidence moves across jurisdictions, how cell phone data and purchase records become vital threads, and how forensic pathology struggles with decomposition. But it also showed limits. Lannon's broader claims were never fully validated. Some specifics in his affidavit were contradicted or uncorroborated, and communities were left with a combination of accountability and lingering mystery. Cases like this remind the public that law enforcement must balance speed with thoroughness, and that confessions are only one part of a larger evidentiary puzzle. When the dust settles, the story of Sean Lannon reads like a cautionary, tragic ledger. A family torn, a town frightened, a man who admitted to horrors as he moved through different states, and a legal end that promises punishment, but not the restoration of life to those stolen. For viewers, there is a double responsibility in consuming these stories: to remember the victims as people rather than case numbers, and to push for the kind of community support that helps families recover in practical ways. And if anything can be said about justice in this case, it is that it arrived in slow, deliberate stages, and that it will never repair the small daily losses felt by those who loved Jennifer, Matthew, Jesson, Randall, and Michael. Thank you for staying with us, and I do hope you already subscribed to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss a case. Like and share the video. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.